All right. Hello, everybody. Hello, TYZJ and FE. That's right. Medicine time. We're going to go out and get some Madison today. Oh, yeah. I had this one open. I wanted to see how much more Madison we had, actually. So this is the list of the Federalist Papers on Wikipedia, and it's color-coded by author. We are currently right here. Whoops. Right here. That's what we're doing tonight. And we're going to be doing Madison for a really long time. We're all the way to number 58 is going to be James Madison. Yeah, yeah. So Dex, remember when Adam said Independence Day would be on July 2nd? I know he said that, but right away he started celebrating it on the 4th. I think like 1 year later, 2 years later. I think everybody figured it out within a year or two that it was going to be that day. Well, okay, yeah. So let's remember where we are. We're at a stage in the Federalist Papers where Publius is making the case that the proposed government that came out of the Philadelphia Convention, the proposed Constitution, will actually be a Republican form of government, not a tyranny. That the proposed powers that the powers that are being proposed for the federal government are not an overreach, but are actually necessary and good. So that's basically where we are, and we're going to be in this part of the argument of the Federalist Papers for a couple more weeks after tonight, and then Publius will move into talking about the separation of powers between the branches. Oh, and states. That's part of the state. Federal versus state, but that's part of that overreach idea. Then separation of powers, and then we'll start going through the Constitution more closely, bit by bit, article by article, and that'll be the balance of the Federalist Papers once we get to that point. All right, so let's start with number 41 tonight. The Constitution proposed by the Convention may be considered under two general points of view. The first relates to the sum or quantity of power which it vests in the government, including the restraints imposed on the states. The second, the particular structure of the government and the distribution of this power among its several branches. Under the first view of the subject, two important questions arise. One, whether any part of the powers transferred to the general government be unnecessary or improper, and two, whether the entire mass of them be dangerous to the portion of jurisdiction left in the several states. So he's laying out like what he's going to be covering, and he's kind of making an outline. Roman numeral 1, how much power is being vested in the government, and then under that are 2 points. Whether the power is unnecessary and whether that power is going to interfere with the states and usurp state power. And then later on, he'll get to the second point about the structure of the government, distribution of power among the several branches. Now, this is his plan for, well, pretty much the rest of the Federalist Papers, if I'm reading him correctly. This first part relating to the sum or quantity of power which is vested in the government is going to be the topic for the next 10 or so essays. So he's giving a plan not for this particular essay, but for like long term, where we're going from here in the Federalist Papers. All right, so Madison continues. Is the aggregate power of the general government greater than ought to have been vested in it? This is our first question. It cannot have escaped those who have attended with candor to the arguments employed against the extensive powers of the government, that the authors of them have very little considered how far these powers were necessary means of attaining a necessary end. They have chosen rather to dwell on the inconveniences which must be unavoidably blended with all political advantages, and on the possible abuses which must be incident to every power or trust of which a beneficial use can be made. So he's addressing the anti-federalists. He's talking about the anti-federalists, and he's saying he's talking about the arguments that they have raised against the proposed Constitution. This method of handling the subject cannot impose on the good sense of the people of America. It may display the subtlety of the writer, it may open a boundless field for rhetoric and declamation, it may inflame the passions of the unthinking and may confirm the prejudices of the misthinking. But cool and candid people will at once reflect that the purest of human blessings must have a portion of alloy in them, that the choice must always be made, if not of the lesser evil, at least of the greater, not the perfect, good, and that in every political institution a power to advance the public happiness involves a discretion which may be misapplied and abused. They will see, therefore, that in all cases where power is to be conferred, the point first to be decided is whether such a power be necessary to the public good, as the next will be, in case of an affirmative decision, to guard as effectually as possible against a perversion of the power to the public detriment. So, to summarize what he's saying there, like, the Anti-Federalists are picking out every little bad thing that could possibly be said about the proposed Constitution, but the point is not to find whether the Constitution is absolutely perfect in every little detail, but rather, in general, whether the good that the Constitution is accomplishing is going to be outweigh the bad, because it's impossible to create a perfect document. You're going to have a good document. Hopefully, you're going to have a good document, but there will always be imperfections in it. All right, so Madison continues. That we may form a correct judgment on this subject, it will be proper to review the several powers conferred on the government of the Union, and that this may be the more conveniently done, they may be reduced into different classes as they relate to the following different objects. 1. Security against foreign danger. 2. Regulation of the intercourse with foreign nations. 3. Maintenance of harmony and proper intercourse among the states. 4. Certain miscellaneous objects of general utility. 5. Restraint of the states from certain injurious acts. 6. Provisions for giving due efficacy to all these powers. So he's going to be covering each of these points in turn, and he's going to do it over the course of 3 or 4 essays. Like, he's not going to cover all of this in this essay. He's going to address like 1 or 2 in this essay, and then he's going to move on. Text. I guess I should allow that. It's so funny that the automod flagged intercourse. Okay. FB I feel like I'm saying that wrong. Sufficient power to be an effective government is necessary. Sufficient power to be dangerous if abused. Yeah, that's true. Well, that's the catch-22 of making any kind of government. Yeah. In order to absolutely guarantee that your government will not, commit any abuses, you have to make it so it doesn't have any power at all. But then if it doesn't have any power at all, there's no point in even having the government. You're kind of stuck with that. The powers falling within the first class, which is security against foreign danger, are those of declaring war and granting letters of marque, of providing armies and fleets, of regulating and calling forth the militia, of levying and borrowing money. Security against foreign danger is one of the primitive objects of civil society. It is an avowed and essential object of the American Union. The powers requisite for attaining it must be effectually confided to the federal councils. Is the power of declaring war necessary? No man will answer this question in the negative. It would be superfluous, therefore, to enter into a proof of the affirmative. The existing confederation establishes this power in the most ample form. And this is a point that he's going to return to several times, if I remember correctly. He's going to be like, okay, well, you don't like that the federal government is, the proposed government form is going to have this power. Well, the Articles of Confederation had this power. He's going to say that again. Yeah, letters of marque. That's for like privateers, isn't it? I don't think that would really work with modern navies, with modern naval technology. I think that's what it means. Isn't that what it means? I feel like I need to look that up. Should I look that up? That's what that means. Government license in the age of sail that offers a private... Yeah, privateers. Okay. Yeah, I don't even know how that would work nowadays. Okay. Is the power of raising armies and equipping fleets necessary? This is involved in the foregoing power. It is involved in the power of self-defense. But was it necessary to give an indefinite power of raising troops, as well as providing fleets, and of maintaining both in peace as well as in war? The answer to these questions has been too far anticipated in another place to admit an extensive discussion of them in this place. The answer indeed seems to be so obvious and conclusive as scarcely to justify such a discussion in any place. With what color of propriety the force necessary for defense be limited by those who cannot limit the force of offense? In other words, like when he says the force of offense, he's talking about foreign nations, aggressors threatening the United States. Like we can't control how much force they would bring to bear. So how can we predict ahead of time how much force we would need for defense? If a federal constitution could chain the ambition or set bounds to the exertions of all other nations, then indeed might it prudently chain the discretion of its own government and set bounds to the exertions for its own safety. How could a readiness for war in time of peace be safely prohibited, unless we could prohibit it in like manner the preparations and establishments of every hostile nation? The means of security can only be regulated by the means and the danger of attack. They will, in fact, be ever determined by these rules and by no other. It is vain to oppose constitutional barriers to the impulse of self-preservation. It is worse than in vain. It plants in the Constitution itself necessary usurpations of power, every precedent of which is a germ of unnecessary and multiplied repetitions. If one nation maintains constantly a disciplined army, ready for the service of ambition or revenge, it obliges the most pacific nations, who may be within the reach of its enterprises, to take corresponding precautions. The 15th century was the unhappy epoch of military establishments in time of peace. They were introduced by Charles VII of France. All Europe has followed or been forced into the example. Had the example not been followed by other nations, all Europe must long ago have worn the chains of a universal monarch. Were every nation except France now to disband its peace establishment, the same event might follow. The veteran legions of Rome were an overmatch for the undisciplined valor of all other nations, and rendered her mistress of the world. Not less true is it that the liberties of Rome proved the final victim to her military triumphs, and that the liberties of Europe, as far as they ever existed, have, with few exceptions, been the price of her military establishments. A standing force, therefore, is dangerous at the same time that it may be a necessary provision. On the smallest scale, it has its inconveniences. On an extensive scale, its consequences may be fatal. On any scale, it is an object of laudable circumspection and precaution. A wise nation will combine all these considerations, and whilst it does not rashly preclude itself from any resource which may become essential to its safety, it will exert all its prudence in diminishing both the necessity and the danger of resorting to one which may be inauspicious to its liberties. Okay, just getting caught up on the chat. I love this idea of like having privateers in the 21st century. just random destroyers wandering around shooting at people. Well, okay, it's not just Madison. So the question is, why does Madison find it so obvious that a standing army is so dangerous to liberty? Everyone, that was everybody. That wasn't just Madison. Everybody, that was an assumption that people made. It was just in general, everyone felt that way because the government could use the standing army against the people. Why? That's why it's dangerous to liberty. I mean, obviously, I mean, in retrospect, we have a standing army. We've had a standing army for over a century, and it hasn't, it hasn't affected our liberty. I don't think so. Maybe I'm wrong on that. Suddenly realized somebody might take exception to what I just said, but I don't think so. But yeah, like from their perspective, that was pretty much so the position that Madison and Hamilton are in is that they have to justify why the federal government should have the capacity for creating a standing army. Why we should even give the federal government that power, given that one of the criticisms of the proposed Constitution is that it did not write into the Constitution that the government would not maintain a standing army. And so he has to make the case that actually sometimes, we can't predict the future. We can't predict what dangers the U.S. will be in. We can't assume that a standing army might not be necessary to preserve liberty in the future. Yeah, so we don't tend to use military as a national police force. It's actually disallowed, I guess by statute. The military cannot be used for police powers within the country. Okay. The clearest marks of this prudence are stamped on the proposed Constitution. The Union itself, which it cements and secures, destroys every pretext for a military establishment which could be dangerous. So here he's giving some reassurance to people who would be afraid of having a standing army, afraid of the government having this ability to maintain an army. The Union itself, he says, which it cements and secures, which the Constitution cements and secures, destroys every pretext for a military establishment which could be dangerous. America united with a handful of troops or without a single soldier exhibits a more forbidding posture to foreign ambition than America disunited, with 100,000 veterans ready for combat. It was remarked on a former occasion that the want of this pretext had saved the liberties of one nation in Europe. Being rendered by her insular situation and her maritime resources impregnable to the armies of her neighbors, the rulers of Great Britain have never been able by real or artificial dangers to cheat the public into an extensive peace establishment. The distance of the United States from the powerful nations of the world gives them the same happy security. A dangerous establishment can never be necessary or plausible so long as they continue a united people. But let it never for a moment be forgotten that they are indebted for this advantage to their union alone. The moment of its dissolution will be the date of a new order of things. The fears of the weaker or the ambitions of the stronger states or confederacies will set the same example in the new as Charles VII did in the old world. The example will be followed here from the same motives which produced universal imitation there. Instead of deriving from our situation the precious advantage which Great Britain has derived from hers, the face of America will be but a copy of that of the continent of Europe. It will present liberty everywhere crushed between standing armies and perpetual taxes. Fortunes of disunited America will be even more disastrous than those of Europe. Sources of evil in the latter are confined to their own limits. No superior powers of another quarter of the globe intrigue among her rival nations, inflame their mutual animosities, and render them the instruments of foreign ambition, jealousy, and revenge. In America, the miseries springing from her internal jealousies, contentions, and wars would form a part only of her lot. A plentiful addition of evils would have their source in that relation in which Europe stands to this quarter of the earth, and which no other quarter of the earth bears to Europe. So in this paragraph, he actually turns it around on the critics, and he says, the way to guarantee that the military will stay small is to have the Union. Because if you have the Union, you essentially make the country a giant island with no neighbors threatening it, just like Great Britain is an island with no neighbors that can come from the continent and invade it. And since Great Britain, with being an island, it was able to not maintain a standing army in peacetime, which, according to Madison and the kind of conventional wisdom at the time, was why Britain, or at least one of the reasons why Great Britain had more personal liberties than other countries in Europe. And so he's saying if you want a small military, then you want union, because the union, by having a union, you'll take away the necessity for maintaining military, establishments. And the way to have union is by passing the Constitution. If you don't do the Constitution, and we end up with a bunch of different countries that are, rivals to each other, then they will militarize. So you'll have more military funding, more military, more armies and stuff in that situation. Well, no, I don't think he's referring to acquiring British North America, what we now call Canada. I don't think that's what he's intending. I think he's just means. Well, I guess he doesn't really say exactly what he means, but my reading of it is he's just not anticipating a military confrontation against the British. That doesn't make really sense, does it? Well, I guess if you only have two neighbors, maybe that's the logic. You only have two neighbors, and they're instead of having lots of little countries that are constantly. I don't know. Yeah. I guess, yeah, that's something to take up with Madison. Yeah. Maybe that's a hole in his argument. This picture of the consequences of disunion cannot be too highly colored or too often exhibited. Every man who loves peace, every man who loves his country, every man who loves liberty, ought to have it ever before his eyes, that he may cherish in his heart a due attachment to the Union of America, and be able to set a due value on the means of preserving it. Next to the effectual establishment of the Union, the best possible precaution against danger from standing armies is a limitation of the term for which revenue may be appropriated to their support. This precaution the Constitution has prudently added. I will not repeat here the observations which I flatter myself have placed this subject in a just and satisfactory light. But it may not be improper to take notice of an argument against this part of the Constitution, which has been drawn from the policy and practice of Great Britain. It is said that the continuance of an army in that kingdom requires an annual vote of the legislature, whereas the American Constitution has lengthened this critical period to 2 years. This is the form in which the comparison is usually stated to the public. But is it a just form? Is it a fair comparison? Does the British Constitution restrain the parliamentary discretion to 1 year? Does the American impose on the Congress appropriations for 2 years? On the contrary, it cannot be unknown to the authors of the fallacy themselves that the British Constitution fixes no limit whatever to the discretion of the legislature, and that the American ties down the legislature to 2 years as the longest admissible term. Hey, Blue Harino. Maybe you assumed Canada would eventually just become part of the Union. Well, I mean, that was a hope that many people at the time had. That they would. But at this point in 1788, I'm not sure if anyone was really holding their breath. That was something that was envisioned, back in back toward, when the war was still going on, 1780, 1781, or late 1770s, when the Articles of Confederation were adopted, went into effect. Kind of went into effect before they were ratified. Anyway, when they were written and they were kind of working de facto in the late 1770s. But by the time you get to 1788, I'm not sure if anyone was really expecting that. Yeah, Dex says they were full of loyalists. That's true. A bunch of loyalists went to what is now Canada, making it less likely that they would join. Did Madison have a copy of the British Constitution? He seems to know a lot about what it says. Well, all of them did. The British do not have they don't have a written constitution. The British Constitution is they call it an unwritten constitution. I think that's the term they use. But it's a collection of documents. It's sort of it's like it starts with Magna Carta, and then they have I can't remember what the documents were surrounding the Glorious Revolution, and then it continues on. There's more documents. So basically, knowing the British Constitution means being familiar with British colonial history, British political history, and knowing the big highlights of British British political history. Let's see what the documents are. Oh, wait. So, yeah, comprises the written and unwritten arrangements that establish the United Kingdom. Yeah, no official attempt has been made to codify such arrangements into a single document. So it's an uncodified, I guess they call it, uncodified constitution. But, yeah, they don't list stuff, huh? I know there are certain documents that are considered really key. I don't remember now. Anyway. But yeah, just by virtue of being educated, he would have been familiar with that stuff. Disorganized, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. How do you even say that? Bajo? Badget. Oh. I was trying to say it like a Frenchman. Badget. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, where was I? Oh yeah, so this is getting to like comparing the criticism is the British they fund their military on an annual basis, but the Constitution says reappropriate no more than every 2 years. And he says that's not a fair comparison. Had the argument from the British example been truly stated, it would have stood thus. The term for which supplies may be appropriated to the army establishment, though unlimited by the British Constitution, has nevertheless in practice been limited by parliamentary discretion to a single year. Now, if in Great Britain, where the House of Commons is elected for 7 years, where so great a proportion of the members are elected by so small a proportion of the people, where the electors are so corrupted by the representatives, and the representatives so corrupted by the crown, the representative body can possess a power to make appropriations to the army for an indefinite term, without desiring or without daring to extend the term beyond a single year. Ought not suspicion herself to blush in pretending that the representatives of the United States, elected freely by the whole body of the people, every second year, cannot be safely entrusted with a discretion over such appropriations expressly limited to the short period of 2 years? A bad cause seldom fails to betray itself. Of this truth, the management of the opposition to the federal government is an unvaried exemplification. But among all the blunders which have been committed, none is more striking than the attempt to enlist on that side the prudent jealousy entertained by the people of standing armies. The attempt has awakened fully the public attention to that important subject, and has led to investigations which must terminate in a thorough and a universal conviction not only that the Constitution has provided the most effectual guards against danger from that quarter, but that nothing short of a Constitution fully adequate to the national defense and the preservation of the Union can save America from as many standing armies as it may be split into states or confederacies, and from such a progressive augmentation of these establishments in each, as will render them as burdensome to the properties and ominous to the liberties of the people as any establishment that can become necessary under a united and efficient government must be tolerable to the former and safe to the latter. The palpable necessity of the power to provide and maintain a navy has protected that part of the Constitution against a spirit of censure which has spared few other parts. It must indeed be numbered among the greatest blessings of America that as her Union will be the only source of her maritime strength, so this will be a principal source of her security against danger from abroad. In this respect, our situation bears another likeness to the insular advantage of Great Britain. Batteries most capable of repelling foreign enterprise on our safety are happily such as can never be turned by a perfidious government against our liberties. The inhabitants of the Atlantic frontier are all of them deeply interested in this provision for naval protection, and if they have hitherto been suffered to sleep quietly in their beds, if their property has remained safe against the predatory spirit of licentious adventurers, if their maritime towns have not yet been compelled to ransom themselves from the terrors of a conflagration by yielding to the exactions of daring and sudden invaders, these instances of good fortune are not to be ascribed to the capacity of the existing government for the protection of those from whom it claims allegiance, but to causes that are fugitive and fallacious. If we except perhaps Virginia and Maryland, which are peculiarly vulnerable on their eastern frontiers, No part of the Union ought to feel more anxiety on this subject than New York. Her seacoast is extensive. The very important district of the state is an island. The state itself is penetrated by a large navigable river for more than 50 leagues. The great emporium of its commerce, the great reservoir of its wealth, lies every moment at the mercy of events, and may almost be regarded as a hostage for ignominious compliances with the dictates of a foreign enemy, or even with the rapacious demands of pirates and barbarians. Should a war be the result of the precarious situation of European affairs, and all the unruly passions attending it be let loose on the ocean, our escape from insults and depredations, not only on that element, but every part of the other bordering on it, will be truly miraculous. In the present condition of America, the states more immediately exposed to these calamities have nothing to hope from the phantom of a general government which now exists, and if their single resources were equal to the task of fortifying themselves against the danger, the object to be protected would be almost consumed by the means of protecting them. The power of regulating and calling forth the militia has been already sufficiently vindicated and explained. The power of levying and borrowing money, being the sinew of that which is to be exerted in the national defense, is properly thrown into the same class with it. This power also has been examined already with much attention, and has, I trust, been clearly shown to be necessary both in the extent and form given to it by the Constitution. I will address one additional reflection only, to those who contend that the power ought to have been restrained to external taxation, by which they mean taxes on articles imported from other countries. It cannot be doubted that this will always be a valuable source of revenue, that for a considerable time it must be a principal source, that at this moment it is an essential one. But we may form very mistaken ideas on this subject if we do not call to mind in our calculations that the extent of revenue drawn from foreign commerce must vary with the variations, both in the extent and the kind of imports, and that these variations do not correspond with the progress of population, which must be the general measure of the public wants. As long as agriculture continues the sole field of labor, the importation of manufactures must increase as the consumers multiply. As soon as domestic manufactures are begun by the hands not called for by agriculture, the imported manufactures will decrease as the numbers of people increase. In a more remote stage, the imports may consist in a considerable part of raw materials, which will be wrought into articles for exportation, and will therefore require rather the encouragement of bounties than to be loaded with discouraging duties. A system of government meant for duration ought to contemplate these revolutions and be able to accommodate itself to them. I think this is an interesting. It just strikes me that, um, uh, first of all, that this portion of the essay is dealing with something that's really not relevant to the U.S. today. The federal government receives relatively very little revenue from imports, and it kind of like it's interesting to see the contrast. Of course, we're seeing it through Madison's eyes, but the contrast between thinking about the short term versus thinking about applying the Constitution for long-term situations, and thinking about what's likely to transpire decades in the future and how we need to adapt, like have the system be ready to apply to different situations. Okay, so some who have not denied the necessity of the power of taxation have grounded a very fierce attack against the Constitution on the language on which it is defined. It has been urged and echoed that the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, pay debts, and to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States amounts to an unlimited commission to exercise every power which may be alleged to be necessary for the common defense or general welfare. No stronger proof could be given of the distress under which these writers labor for objections than their stooping to such a misconstruction. Had no other enumeration or definition of the powers of the Congress been found in the Constitution than the general expressions just cited, the authors of the objection might have had some color for it, though it would have been difficult to find a reason for so awkward a form of describing an authority to legislate in all possible cases. A power to destroy the freedom of the press, the trial by jury, or even to regulate the course of dissents, or the forms of conveyances, must be very singularly expressed by the terms to raise money for the general welfare. But what color can the objection have when a specification of the objects alluded to by these general terms immediately follows, and is not even separated by a longer pause than a semicolon? If the different parts of the same instrument ought to be so expounded as to give meaning to every part which it will bear it, shall one part of the same sentence be excluded altogether from a share in the meaning, and shall the more doubtful and indefinite terms be retained in their full extent, and the clear and precise expressions be denied any signification whatsoever? For what purpose could the enumeration of particular powers be inserted, if these and all others were meant to be included in the preceding general power? Nothing is more natural or common than first to use a general phrase, and then to explain and qualify it by a recital of particulars. But the idea of an enumeration of particulars, which neither explain nor qualify the general meaning, and can have no other effect than to confound and mislead, is an absurdity which, as we are reduced to the dilemma of charging either on the authors of the objection or on the authors of the Constitution, we must take the liberty of supposing had not its origins with the latter. The objection here is the more extraordinary, as it appears that the language used by the Convention is a copy from the Articles of Confederation. The objects of the Union among the states, as described in Article 3rd, are their common defense, security of their liberties, and mutual and general welfare. The terms of Article 8th are still more identical. All charges of war and all other expenses that shall be incurred for the common defense or general welfare and allowed by the United States and Congress shall be defrayed out of a common treasury, etc. A similar language again occurs in Article 9. Construe either of these articles by the rules which would justify the construction put on the new Constitution, and they vest in the existing Congress a power to legislate in all cases whatsoever. But what would have been thought of that assembly, if, attaching themselves to these general expressions, and disregarding the specifications which ascertain and limit their import, they had exercised an unlimited power of providing for the common defense and general welfare? I appeal to the objectors themselves whether they would in that case have employed the same reasoning and justification of Congress as they now make use of against the Convention. How difficult it is for error to escape its own condemnation. Publius. So there, that last part of that essay was doing that same thing I mentioned before, like just, if you don't like this, well, it's doing the same thing the Articles of Confederation were doing, and you were fine with that, so, oh my gosh, TYZJ. I can't believe people were worried that the national government would stretch its understanding of what powers the Constitution grants it. Well, I mean, that is a perennial issue. I mean, it comes up, I mean, it came up in the 1790s, actually, with the Congress, like the government will do whatever for the general welfare clause of the Constitution. And that was a big argument over whether that was overstretch. Did Madison just spend a page and a half saying that the list is a list, not a partial set of examples? Yes, that's my understanding. Yes. Yeah, and reading it, I was reminded of the arguments under the first Congress, and Madison's interpretation. I feel like I'm seeing hints of Madison's objections to Hamilton here, where Madison's saying, well, it's circumscribed. And then Hamilton's going to come in later and say, well, it's not really circumscribed. Oh yeah, okay. That was sarcastic. Yep. Thing is, I don't know if there's a way to fix it. Like, no matter how much you say in a constitution, there's always still scope for ambiguity or scope for reading it different ways. So, all right. So now we're moving on to number 42. Same view continued. Wait, Jefferson had good ideas on how to fix it, but Twitch doesn't like some of his quotes? What does that mean? You mean the auto mod? Is that what you're talking about? Now I'm curious what Jefferson was saying that would get flagged by Twitch. Oh, right. Right. Watering the tree of liberty. Watering, so to speak. Yeah, I guess that's, yeah, good point. Um, yep. I mean, Jefferson had some pretty, I won't say he had some extreme views, but he would say things sometimes that were pretty extreme. It's funny that he's, people don't really talk about him as being somebody who said things that were inflammatory or were questionable. Everybody just talks about the Declaration of Independence. Number 42. The second class of powers lodged in the general government consists of those which regulate the intercourse with foreign nations, to wit, to make treaties, to send and receive ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas, and offenses against the law of nations, to regulate foreign commerce, including a power to prohibit after the year 1808 the importation of slaves, and to lay an intermediate duty of $10 per head as a discouragement to such importations. This class of powers forms an obvious and essential branch of the federal administration. If we are to be one nation in any respect, it clearly ought to be in respect to other nations. The powers to make treaties, and to send and receive ambassadors, speak their own propriety. Both of them are comprised in the Articles of Confederation, with this difference only, that the former is disembarrassed by the plan of the convention of an exception under which treaties might be substantially frustrated by regulations of the states, and that a power of appointing and receiving other public ministers and consuls is expressly and very properly added to the former provision concerning ambassadors. The term ambassador, if taken strictly, as seems to be required by the second of the Articles of Confederation, comprehends the highest grade only of public ministers, and excludes the grades which the United States will be most likely to prefer where foreign embassies may be necessary. And under no latitude of construction will the term comprehend consuls. Yet it has been found expedient, and has been the practice of Congress, to employ the inferior grades of public ministers and to send and receive consuls. It is true that where treaties of commerce stipulate for the mutual appointment of consuls, whose functions are connected with commerce, the admission of foreign consuls may fall within the power of making commercial treaties, and that where no such treaties exist, the mission of American consuls into foreign countries may perhaps be covered under the authority given by the 9th Article of the Confederation to appoint all such civil officers as may be necessary for managing the general affairs of the United States. But the admission of consuls into the United States, where no previous treaty has stipulated it, seems to have been nowhere provided for. A supply of the omission is one of the lesser instances in which the convention have improved on the model before them. But the most minute provisions become important when they tend to obviate the necessity or the pretext for gradual and unobserved usurpations of power. A list of the cases in which Congress have been betrayed or forced by the defects of the Confederation into violations of their chartered authorities would not a little surprise those who have paid no attention to the subject, and would be no inconsiderable argument in favor of the new Constitution, which seems to have provided no less studiously for the lesser than for the more obvious and striking defects of the old. The power to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations belongs with equal propriety to the general government, and is a still greater improvement on the Articles of Confederation. These articles contain no provision for the case of offenses against the law of nations, consequently leave it in the power of any indiscreet member to embroil the Confederacy with foreign nations. The provision of the federal articles on the subject of piracies and felonies extends no farther than to the establishment of courts for the trial of these offenses. The definition of piracies might perhaps without inconveniency be left to the law of nations, though a legislative definition of them is found in most municipal codes. A definition of felonies on the high seas is evidently requisite, Felony is a term of loose signification, even in the common law of England, and of various import in the statute law of that kingdom. But neither the common nor the statute law of that or of any other nation ought to be a standard for the proceedings of this unless previously made its own by legislative adoption. The meaning of the term as defined in the codes of the previous states would be as impracticable as the former would be a dishonorable and illegitimate guide. It is not precisely the same in any two of the states, and varies in each with every revision of its criminal laws. For the sake of certainty and uniformity, therefore, the power of defining felonies in this case was in every respect necessary and proper. The regulation of foreign commerce, having fallen within several views which have been taken to this subject, has been too fully discussed to need additional proofs here of its being properly submitted to the federal administration. All right, any questions so far? All right, good. Now he's going to get into talking about slavery a little bit, and this was a very contentious issue. One of the provisions in the Constitution says that Congress cannot restrict the importation of slaves before the year 1808. So some people who were opposed to slavery at the time felt that that was bad, that it's giving license to the importation of slaves. All right. It were doubtless to be wished that the power of prohibiting the importation of slaves had not been postponed until the year 1808, or rather that it had been suffered to have immediate operation. But it is not difficult to account either for this restriction on the general government or for the manner in which the whole cause is expressed. It ought to be considered as a great point gained in favor of humanity, that a period of 20 years may terminate forever within these states a traffic which has so long and so loudly upbraided the barbarism of modern policy, that within that period it will receive a considerable discouragement from the federal government, and may be totally abolished by a concurrence of the few states which continue the unnatural traffic, in the prohibitory example which has been given by so great a majority of the Union. Happy would it be for the unfortunate Africans if an equal prospect lay before them of being redeemed from the oppression of their European brethren. Attempts have been made to pervert this clause into an objection against the Constitution, by representing it, on one side, as a criminal toleration of an illicit practice, and on another, as calculated to prevent voluntary and beneficial emigrations from Europe to America. I mention these misconstructions not with a view to give them an answer, for they deserve none, but as specimens of the manner and spirit in which some have thought it fit to conduct their opposition to the proposed government. All right, so now he's coming to the third class. Powers included in the third class are those which provide for the harmony and proper intercourse among the states. Under this head might be included the particular restraints imposed on the authority of the states and certain powers of the judicial department, but the former are reserved for a distinct class, and the latter will be particularly examined when we arrive at the structure and organizations of the government. I shall confine myself to a cursory review of the remaining powers comprehended under this third description, to wit, to regulate commerce among the several states and the Indian tribes, to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the current coin and securities of the United States, to fix the standard of weights and measures, to establish an uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws of bankruptcy, to prescribe the manner in which the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of each state shall be proved, and the effect they shall have in other states, and to establish post offices and post roads. The defect of power in the existing confederacy to regulate the commerce between its several members is in the number of those which have been clearly pointed out by experience. In other words, under the Articles of Confederation, there was really, no federal level. I mean, I'm using the term federal very loosely with regard to the Articles of Confederation, but there was nothing stopping the states from putting up trade barriers or immigration barriers between the states. The defect of power in the existing confederacy, the Articles of Confederation, to regulate the commerce between its several members is in the number of those which have been clearly pointed out by experience. To the proofs and remarks which former papers have brought into view on this subject, it may be added that without this supplemental provision, the great and essential power of regulating foreign commerce would have been incomplete and ineffectual. A very material object of this power was the relief of the states which import and export through other states from the improper contributions levied on them by the latter. Were these at liberty to regulate the trade between state and state, it must be foreseen that ways would be found out to load the articles of import and export during the passage through their jurisdiction with duties which would fall on the makers of the latter and the consumers of the former. We may be assured by past experience that such a practice would be introduced by future contrivances, and both by that and a common knowledge of human affairs, that it would nourish unceasing animosities, and not improbably terminate in serious interruptions of the public tranquillity. To those who do not view the question through the medium of passion or of interest, the desire of the commercial states to collect in any form an indirect revenue from their uncommercial neighbors must appear not less impolitic than it is unfair, since it would stimulate the injured party by resentment as well as interest to resort to less convenient channels for their foreign trade. By the mild voice of reason, pleading the cause of an enlarged and permanent interest, is but too often drowned before public bodies as well as individuals by the clamors of an impatient avidity for immediate and immoderate gain. The necessity of a superintending authority over the reciprocal trade of confederated states has been illustrated by other examples as well as our own. In Switzerland, where the union is so very slight, each canton is obliged to allow to merchandises a passage through its jurisdiction into other cantons without an augmentation of the tolls. In Germany, it is a law of the empire that the princes and states shall not lay tolls or customs on bridges, rivers, or passages without the consent of the emperor and diet. Though it appears from a quotation in an antecedent paper that the practice in this, as in many other instances in that confederacy, has not followed the law, has produced there the mischiefs which have been foreseen here. Among the restraints imposed by the Union of the Netherlands on its members, one is that they shall not establish imposts disadvantageous to their neighbors without the general permission. So all this just to say, just in general, it's not unreasonable. In other words, it is reasonable for the federal government to regulate commerce between the states. That's not out of bounds for the federal government to do that. Catching up on the chat, I gather that there wasn't a lot of disagreement about slavery in New York. Actually, there was quite a lot of disagreement. I don't know if you're being sarcastic there, too. It had not yet been abolished in New York at this point. Superseding regulation of interstate commerce seems like a necessary component of sovereignty. Yes. I mean, I would agree. Yeah. The regulation of commerce with the Indian tribes is very properly unfettered from two limitations in the Articles of Confederation, which render the provision obscure and contradictory. The power there restrained to Indians, not members of any of the states, is not to violate or infringe the legislative right of any state within its own limits. What description of Indians are to be deemed members of a state is not yet settled, and has been a question of frequent perplexity and contention in the federal councils. And how the trade with Indians, though not members of a state, yet residing within its legislative jurisdiction, can be regulated by an external authority, without so far intruding on the internal rights of legislation, is absolutely incomprehensible. This is not the only case in which the Articles of Confederation have inconsiderately endeavored to accomplish impossibilities, to reconcile a partial sovereignty in the Union with complete sovereignty in the states, to subvert a mathematical axiom by taking away a part and letting the whole remain. In other words, he's pointing out an inconsistency in the Articles of Confederation between allowing states full control over their own commerce and also saying commerce with the Indians is going to be handled by the Congress. All that need be remarked on the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin is that by providing for this last case, the Constitution has supplied a material omission in the Articles of Confederation. The authority of the existing Congress is restrained to the regulation of coins struck by their own authority, or that of the respective states. It must be seen at once that the proposed uniformity in the value of the current coin might be destroyed by subjecting that of the foreign coin to the different regulations of the different states. Um, and he mentions coinage because only coins were to be coined by the government, were to be minted by the government. Um, that's in the Constitution, that only the federal government will mint coins. But it doesn't say anything about paper money. And so paper money was generally something that banks issued. Um, but yeah, so it's not until probably, I guess, was it the Civil War was the first time the federal government started issuing paper money? Um, somebody who's better at American history might be able to call that for me, but I think that's the case. Yeah, the greenbacks. Yeah. And that's when they started being green, I guess. Um, the punishment of counterfeiting the public securities. I was quite alarmed, by the way, when they started putting color in American currency. It was like, it's supposed to be green. It's supposed to just be green. Anyway, the punishment of counterfeiting the public security. That's because I'm old. I mean, by this time, I think grown-ass adults have lived their entire lives with multicolored currency bills. But anyway, punishment of counterfeiting the public securities, as well as of the current coin, is submitted, of course, to that authority which is to secure the value of both. The regulation of weights and measures is transferred from the Articles of Confederation and is founded on like considerations with the preceding power of regulating coin. The dissimilarity in the rules of naturalization has long been remarked as a fault in our system, and as laying a foundation for intricate and delicate questions. In the 4th article of the Confederation, it is declared that the free inhabitants of each of these states, paupers, vagabonds, and fugitives from justice excepted, shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of free citizens in the several states, and the people of each state shall in every other enjoy all the privileges of trade and commerce, etc. There is a confusion of language here, which is remarkable. So he's complaining about the verbiage of one of the articles in the Articles of Confederation, how it's so inconsistent as to create legal problems. Why the terms free inhabitants are used in one part of the article, free citizens in another, and people in another, or what was meant by superadding to all privileges and immunities of free citizens all the privileges of trade and commerce, cannot easily be determined. It seems to be a construction scarcely avoidable, however, that those who come under the denomination of free inhabitants of a state, although not citizens of such state, are entitled in every other state to all the privileges of free citizens of the latter, that is, to greater privileges than they may be entitled to in their own state, so that it may be in the power of a particular state, or rather every state, is laid under a necessity not only to confer the rights of citizenship in other states upon any whom it may admit to such rights within itself, but upon any whom it may allow to become inhabitants within its jurisdiction. But were an exposition of the term inhabitants to be admitted, which would confine the stipulated privileges to citizens alone, the difficulty is diminished only, not removed. The very improper power would still be retained by each state of naturalizing aliens in every other state. In one state, residence for a short term confers all the rights of citizenship. In another, qualifications of greater importance are required. An alien, therefore, legally incapacitated for certain rights in the latter, may, by previous residence only in the former, elude his incapacity, and thus the law of one state be preposterously rendered paramount to the law of another within the jurisdiction of the other. We owe it to mere casualty that very serious embarrassments on this subject have been hitherto escaped. In other words, he's using the word casualty here like we would use the word happenstance. It's mere happenstance that this has not become a serious and embarrassing legal issue. By the laws of several states, certain descriptions of aliens who had rendered themselves obnoxious were laid under interdicts inconsistent not only with the rights of citizenship, but with the privileges of residence. What would have been the consequence if such persons, by residence or otherwise, had acquired the character of citizens under the laws of another state, and then asserted their rights as such both to residence and citizenship within the state proscribing them? Whatever the legal consequences might have been, other consequences would probably have resulted of too serious a nature not to be provided against. The new Constitution has accordingly, with great propriety, made provision against them and all others proceeding from the defect of the Confederation on this head by authorizing the general government to establish a uniform rule of naturalization throughout the United States. Okay, looking at the chat again. Why did paper money take over? Coin shortages. No, I think paper money took over because of inflation. Coinage was never, I mean, they did issue coins above $1. But by the time those denominations would have been relevant to people in their day-to-day transactions, paper money had come in. Right? Let me back up. Like, so back in originally, let's see if I can find the United, what would be, I don't know, coin, can I spell coinage? Coins of the United States. Does it show historic ones, though? Is this showing up? Yeah, it's showing up. Okay. I wanted to show you some of the old coins. So originally, like, coins were issued in pennies and half pennies, and I don't think they had dimes right away. I can't remember now. Where's the history of the coin? I'll show you some of the old coins. Oh, I guess there's... Oh, this lists some of them. So we had this half-cent coin for a while. But it's just because the value, like, buying power was so high. Like, this, in today's money, was probably like a $5 bill or something. You know, like, there's been so much inflation since the 1790s. So people pretty much, like, in the early 1800s, people pretty much only used coins, or they used paper, like banknotes that were of low denomination, like coinage, in their day-to-day transactions. I think higher value denominations would only have been used in very rarely, just because, you know, for like really big transactions, like, I don't know, property, real estate or something, because the buying power was so much greater. Like, I mean, this actually touches on kind of one of my little pet issues about the coinage today, because we have pennies and nickels and dimes and stuff, and people hardly ever use them. The value of the penny today, like, we've never in the history of the country had a coin with as low a value as the cent is today. Like, the cent coin 100 years ago was like having a dime or a quarter in today's money or something like that. I mean, I don't remember, you know, because it depends on how far back you go for what the inflation rate was, but or how much you have to adjust for inflation. But yeah, so it's only like, so as time went on, inflation kept happening, buying power kept dropping, people more and more switched to paper money. Another factor is that, you know, paper money, I don't know if this is a factor or not, actually. I'm talking off the top of my head, but paper money back in the old days represented bullion. So you would have a paper bill that represented a certain amount of silver or gold. You'd have silver certificates and gold certificates and stuff. And so use paper money instead of using the silver coins, because for convenience sake. So that's another reason, I think, just talking off the top of my head, I would say that's another reason for switching to paper, was that it was more convenient. Yeah, it's illegal but profitable to melt down pennies for the zinc, which is so, it's so sad that it's gone to that point. I mean, they switched from copper to zinc for that reason, because it used to be like the value of the penny dropped below, the face value dropped below the market value of the copper it was made with. So they switched it to, so they stopped making it with copper in the early 80s. Yeah. Oh yeah, I missed some stuff up here. We were jealous of how much fun New Zealand's money looked like. Yeah. And about speaking of New Zealand, I mean, we almost could have had a really, could have been jealous of their flag too if they had made the right choice and gone with the Kiwi shooting lasers out of its eyes. Yeah, exactly. That's a great summary, actually. Complicated explanation of why letting states determine citizenship allows for weird exploits. Yeah, because under the old system, so what he's talking about citizenship under the Articles of Confederation, each state controlled its own immigration. Which I guess I should clarify that there were no not immigration, because there were no controls on immigration as far as I know, but about citizenship. Each state could control what the rules were for a foreign national who comes over and immigrates for them to gain citizenship rights. So you could have a situation, but because of the way the wording was in the Articles of Confederation, hypothetically, you could have somebody do an exploit where they would arrive in one state, gain the legal status of inhabitant, free inhabitant of that state, and then immediately go to another state next door. Like the next day, they could go to another state and say, well, I'm a free inhabitant of X state, therefore I'm entitled to citizenship in your state, even though that state might have like a 3-year rule for you have to be resident for 3 years to gain citizenship. Or you could have a situation where somebody, due to committing a crime, loses their citizenship rights. But then they're like, well, I'm entitled to citizenship rights because of the other state, the stuff like that. All right. The power of establishing uniform laws of bankruptcy is so intimately connected with the regulation of commerce and will prevent so many frauds where the parties live or their property may lie or be removed into different states that the expediency of it seems not likely to be drawn into question. The power of prescribing by general laws the manner in which the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of each state shall be proved, and the effect they shall have in other states, is an evident and valuable improvement on the clause relating to this subject in the Articles of Confederation. The meaning of the latter is extremely indeterminate, and can be of little importance under any interpretation which it will bear. The power here established may be rendered a very convenient instrument of justice, and be particularly beneficial on the borders of contiguous states, where the effects liable to justice may be suddenly and secretly translated in any stage of the process within a foreign jurisdiction. The power of establishing post roads must, in every view, be a harmless power, and may, perhaps by judicious management, become productive of great public conveniency. Nothing which tends to facilitate the intercourse between the states can be deemed unworthy of the public care. Publius. Interesting, he's really going point by point. Every little thing, every little power that's given to the federal government, he's going to give it. He's going to talk about it. And he's going to say why it's okay. I understand why he's doing that. He wants to cover every possible objection, and I guess another purpose of it is to just lay out here. This really is what the powers are, so that people don't have this idea that it's like some nebulous thing. It could be any powers. No, here are the powers. These are the powers. Let's see. You should get some cheerleaders to do routines during ads. Yeah, I should figure out what I can do. Like, the stream is not very visual, so it's not like you can just, like, watch the visual while the ad is playing. But yeah, if you have any ideas about how I can do that. Kantiash, I don't know how to pronounce that. You know what happens with these usernames? I never know how to pronounce the username, and then, like, later on I'll be like, oh, of course. That's how you're supposed to say it. But yeah, anyway. You can control the ads in the sense that if you play them yourself in set intervals, there won't be... Yeah, you know what? Yes. I mean, I thought so, but then I tried it, and it didn't work. But I don't know if I was doing it wrong. Because what I was doing for a lot of streams, I would try to run an ad right at the beginning. And supposedly that buys you a certain amount of time. But people were still getting ads. So then I think what was happening was I was just making it so that when people came in, they weren't getting a pre-roll right away. for a certain amount of time. I don't know. Oh, when I came up with it, I didn't consider the pronunciation. Maybe that's what's going on with a lot of these usernames. People don't even think about how it's supposed to be pronounced. Establishing roads is harmless until Jefferson uses eminent domain to take Madison's beach house. Yep, I know. You're right. I was just thinking, did anyone have a beach house? I don't think any of the founding fathers had a beach house. Well, I guess technically George Washington had a beach house because his estate went right up to the water, so I guess that was a beach house. I think there's always a pre-roll, but the midstream ads should be controllable. I don't know about the specifics, though. Yeah, I don't really know. I think all I can do is change the timing a little bit, but I don't know if there's anything else I can do about it. I feel like there's got to be a way where if the ad break is like scheduled for 10 minutes from now, if I run it now, that should like reset the clock for 30 more minutes. But I'm not sure if that's the case. Aaron Burr wanted a beach house. Um, uh, is that a reference to which phase of Aaron Burr's life is that a reference to? I was thinking like, yeah, he went out west. I guess he wanted beachfront property out there. Aaron Burr pardoned. Did it go to trial? I don't remember the details about that. I feel like he wasn't criminally liable for the duel. Oh, the court of public opinion. Oh, there's a lot more going on with Aaron Burr than just the duel. I mean, he's got some issues. When was that? That was 1804. Did he leave and go out west right after that? Oh my gosh, I'm displaying my ignorance. I don't remember anything about Aaron Burr. Let's see. So he had a trial, but that was for the conspiracy for the out west. That wasn't for the duel. Was he brought to? Were there charges because of the duel? Oh, dueling had been outlawed. Yeah, it was outlawed in New York, so they went to New Jersey. So, was he criminally liable? I didn't think he was. He fled, though. Oh, he was charged in New Jersey, in New York and New Jersey, but was never tried in either jurisdiction. Okay. He fled to South Carolina. Then he went back to Philadelphia and D.C. to complete his term as vice president. Yeah, and the charges were eventually dropped. Okay. Yeah, I didn't think that. Yeah, okay. Oh, wow. I didn't know this. In the case of New Jersey, the incident was thrown out on the basis that although Hamilton was shot in New Jersey, he died in New York. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, right. It's weird to see so much hate for Hamilton. The more I've read about Hamilton, the more I like him, actually, to be honest with you. I actually wasn't that into him before. I didn't really think about him before, but yeah, TYZJ, New York, we need to annex New Jersey. Do you know about the border dispute between them over where the border goes through the river? I'm sure everybody who's interested in history who watches YouTube is probably familiar with that now. Have I seen the musical? I've seen like 15 or 20 minutes of it. I keep thinking I need to watch it, And every once in a while, I'm like, oh, I really should watch that. And so I'll pick up where I left off. I'll watch it for like 4 minutes, and then I'll get distracted and do something. I mean, it's good. I mean, it's not bad if you like musicals. It's like it's got some catchy tunes. So, I mean, based on the 20 minutes I've seen, I'd recommend it. Yeah, the CGP Grey video. Yeah, absolutely. That's what I was saying. Like, if you're interested in history and you watch YouTube, you've probably seen the CGP Grey video about it. Um, all right. Well, are there any questions on what we've read so far? We're gonna stop with number 42 tonight. We'll pick up next week with 43 and 44. Hamilton rode Washington's coattails into relevance and used his ill-begotten power to lay the groundwork of increasing the size of the government at any time. I disagree. I think, well, I mean, riding his coattails, I mean, technically that's true in the sense that he was literally appointed by Washington. So, yeah. But yeah, laying the groundwork of increasing the size of the government at any time. You know, it's an interesting kind of hypothetical. If Hamilton hadn't been in the picture during Washington's presidency, how different would things have gone with regard to the size of the federal government? Because it was really Hamilton was spearheading that broader interpretation of the Constitution. I wonder if the stricter Jeffersonian interpretation of the Constitution would have been like more hegemonic. Yeah, we'd be a spacefaring nation. That's what would, you know, it's like that. It's that like that meme. What's that dumb meme where they're like ancient, like Greco-Roman civilization was doing science, and then it suddenly drops off, and then and they, you know, they draw the dotted line, like if it hadn't been for the Dark Ages, we would be in space. We'd be a spacefaring civilization now. You should do that, but it's Hamilton where it drops off. Uh, okay, so let's see. Yeah, that stupid Reddit atheist meme, exactly. I would bring it up for you, but I don't want to. I just don't feel like doing a bunch of internet searches like right now in the middle of a stream. Yeah, but it would be funny to make one. But it's the founding fathers, and it's like Hamilton, and then it suddenly drops off. Okay. Well, I guess that's it for tonight. Next Friday, we'll continue on with 43 and 44. He's going to be covering the same topic, as you can see at the beginning of 43. The fourth class comprises, so he's just continuing on with the same line of argument. All right, well, thank you very much for joining me for the stream, and I'll see you next week.